Hi all, I've used Emaze and Screencast-O-Matic to produce this presentation on my WBLT. Both are new programs for me and took some time to learn. Here's the agenda for tonight so you can see where we're going and so I can stay on track. The concept I wanted to cover is not a traditional skill like literacy or numeracy skills. It's actually a cognitive trait. My concept is grit and resilience. Through my practice, I've become interested in these qualities in students. My colleagues and I have often have discussions about the fact that a lot of our students don't seem to have this resilience or grit. It's affecting their academic success, and we've been trying to figure out what, if anything, we can do about it. Angela Duckworth of University of Pennsylvania defines grit as perseverance and passion for long-term goals. So I guess it wasn't surprising that during the first week of this course, while I was sitting in a workshop that was talking about things like WBLTs, that I had the idea to use grit and resilience as my concept. You may be skeptical about how this can work. I was too, but it's been a fascinating research experience, and I'm excited to share what I've done with you. My goal is to try and teach grit and resilience, or to explicitly teach the concept of grit and resilience in an effort to increase student awareness through reading, reflecting, and dialogue. I felt that this could be effective because my WBLT allows for multiple modalities and differentiation. So first I'll explain the objects I've used to create this tool. The primary or anchor tool is called Lesson Paths. It's a curation tool. Teachers can create a series of lessons labeled steps that students can move through. Lesson Paths alone doesn't do all that I wanted or needed, so I had to search around to find other objects. One of those objects is Zaption. Zaption allows users to make video interactive by offering the capabilities of embedding questions right in the middle of the video. The videos can be personal or come from YouTube or Vimeo. The types of questions possible are numerical response, multiple choice, open response, and even a drawn response. According to Churchill's classification of learning objects, these steps fall under the categories of presentation object, practice object, a conceptual model, an information object, and a contextual representation. The theorists and learning theories upon which my WBLT and included activities are based are pictured here. Brunner, Lave, Vygotsky, Gardner, and Bandura. Developing this WBLT was like peeling an onion. There were layers and layers of substance, both in terms of the concept and the tool. And sometimes I cried. Just kidding. Sort of. I had to decide how I wanted to approach presenting this non-cognitive trait of grit and resilience using a web-based learning tool. What were the learning goals? As I've mentioned, these aren't traditional skills, but are qualities that are a key part of success, even more so than IQ or talent, according to Duckworth's research through the University of Pennsylvania. So, with no curriculum expectations from which to draw, I established the learning goals from talks with colleagues and observations made in my practice. As I prepared the proposal check-in, I realized that the learning goals could be divided into two sections, one for the concept and one for the technology. The learning goals for the concept included describing what grit is, reflecting on what grit is, identifying real-world examples of grit, explaining why grit is important, identifying and describing barriers to grit, exploring strategies to develop grit and resilience, establishing and articulating personal goals for developing and improving their own grit and resilience, and making connections. The learning goals for the technology included using technology skills to complete tasks, engage in peer-to-peer collaboration, communicate orally, demonstrate critical thinking through online activities and in-class discussions, as well as reflective journals. This seems like quite a daunting list of learning goals, don't you think? Well, I think the steps that I've included in Lesson Paths allow students the opportunity to meet all of them. This learning object also allows updates and revisions so that I can add steps as I create them. One change I would like to see in this WBLT is in the share feature. When I share it, it shows the steps, so a user may click on step 2 when I really want them to start with step 1. This isn't a huge problem since a simple verbal or written instruction can be given, but I like things to be neater and tidier and more streamlined. So the deployment of this WBLT was quite fun. As I am a special ed resource teacher, I don't have my own class, so I had to borrow one. I arranged to do this in a grade 12 university prep English class. There they are in the picture on this slide. I used this class for a number of reasons. First of all, with the time constraint of the course, I wanted to use a group of students with some technology skills and where devices wouldn't be an issue. The class has a set of laptops due to another project in which the teacher is involved. Another reason why I chose this group is because when I was telling the class teacher about my lesson idea, grit in children's literature, she exclaimed that her class would love that. So my process was fairly easy. I researched online a list of children's books based on perseverance and resilience and grit. I chose 10 of the best, or at least the most interesting to me, and ordered them. The reason I chose children's books was because the grade 12s could use the critical lens for literature that they had developed over the semester with titles of low complexity. Again, time was a serious consideration here since this is the end of the semester, right before exams. They wouldn't have time to fully analyze anything longer. And that brings me to the choice of WBLT. The Zaption videos are more dynamic than just having a teacher read the story. They allow for questions to be embedded within the context of the video. Because it's online, students were able to replay parts of the video if they needed to see the information another time. And I even heard a student say, "What? I don't know. I have to watch that again." Another reason the Zaption is great is because it sends me a file of the answers of all participants. It comes in an Excel file. All paperless, and I can see who did and didn't answer the questions or which questions were skipped. The analytics provide me with this information also, and this function allows for assessment and evaluation. So you might wonder why I had to incorporate Zaption into lesson paths and not use only Zaption. Well, that was actually Sean's question, but I'll answer it. The reason I did this was because lesson paths allows me to include several Zaption tours, all within one topic. I can also include paper tasks, articles, etc., thereby differentiating instruction and appealing to the different learning modalities of students. With Zaption, students would have to go to the site and click on separate tours. With lesson paths, I've found that what I created was more like an online binder of activities and lessons. The assessment for the activities is built in, so a teacher can evaluate the learning quite easily. I think teaching grit and resilience online with interactive learning objects is effective because there's so much more online that I can share with the students than offline in a static environment. This WBLT also lends itself nicely to a blended learning environment, which I tried to incorporate with the grit in children's literature lesson. The video story of the dot, for example, was the online part, and the reading of one of the children's stories was the face-to-face portion. It's very important that I remember the demographic at my school where less than 50% of students have a computer with internet at home. In other words, the flipped classroom doesn't really work well in my school hood. In order to have the students evaluate the WBLT, I distributed Robin Kay's WBLT survey for students from his 2012 paper, Exploring the Use of Web-Based Learning Tools in Secondary School Classrooms, found in the publication Interactive Learning Environments. I've referenced this on the last slide with a DOI if you're interested in searching out the article. Since I was only able to deploy this last Thursday, a thorough analysis of the survey data has not been done. Therefore, I will share with you the results anecdotally. So 11 people participated, 8 responded. All 8 rated the WBLT with a 5, 6, or 7 on quality, learning, and engagement. The only 5 that was given was by one person, and it was in the learning category. For the last 2 sections of liked, didn't like, examples of comments are: I like how interactive it is. I like how we got to draw. Very hands-on, very effective. Having to answer questions throughout the video made me think more. The images provided for learning helped visualize the lesson. The dislike comments were I wish there was a collaborative space on the website. I didn't like how I had to open another tab to do what was needed. The challenges. Briefly, the challenges were primarily technological in nature. I spent some time trying to get my head around what the differences were between a WBLT and a WBLO. I think I have it figured out, and I've tried to use the language properly. I also did a lot of exploring and investigating what is out there and how I could use it and work with it, as far as online tools are concerned. I engaged in a lot of trial and error, which required the biggest challenge, and that was time, or lack of it. I want to emphasize, though, that this was just a challenge, not a barrier. Another challenge was to find and decide on what kind of activities I wanted to include in order to achieve the learning goals of increasing awareness of grit and in naming strategies to improve one's personal grit. I'm also challenged by how to assess improvement in this trait or habit. I think it's not something that can necessarily be assessed over the length of a unit or set of lessons, but is something that would need to be observed over a much longer period of time. In fact, Duckworth's study has extended on for more than 2 years. I think that teachers need to help make it a habit and a routine, and I think it's definitely a field for further research. And then there was the need for research to be done, both on WBLTs and on grit and resilience. When I started out, I wasn't sure just how much was available, as in empirical research or varied perspectives. I found that there's quite a bit on grit and resilience, but certainly not an exhaustive amount. Angela Duckworth is known as Mrs. Grit, and her research is everywhere, and I find quite valid for my purposes. Other names in the grit biz are Carol Dweck, who's the guru of the growth mindset, and Paul Troff, who has written works on how to teach resilience. These are experts in the field, and, I am very interested in continuing to research them. There was quite a bit of research done on learning and the online environment, and a lot of research on WBLTs by Robin Kay. Successes. Well, as far as I'm concerned, anytime I learn something, I call it a success, and I have learned plenty. For example, how to incorporate different WBLOs into a single WBLT. I've learned 2 presentation software platforms, Haiku Deck and eMaze. I learned how to use Screencast-O-Matic, all knowledge that will extend beyond this course. I've also learned a multitude of ways to teach grit and resilience. And I've even really had to have a lot of grit and resilience in order to do this. I think with commitment and grit, there is a way that we can increase the grit and resilience of students by making them aware of what it looks like and how to develop and nurture it. Which brings me to the last part of my presentation. Moving forward, there's so much I'm going to do with this. First of all, I'm going to create another lesson saption path on grit and resilience, but aimed at teachers. I will use similar activities, but with different resources. These would include another TED Talk by Angela Duckworth and work by Carol Dweck and Paul Troff. I'm going to be sharing this new path at a workshop that I'll be presenting for my association, OECDA, in July. I will also share it with my colleagues and maybe beyond. Lesson Paths allows for the steps to be searched globally. I also have plans to add to this for students. There are other activities I want to add. For example, a collaborative space feature. Our students currently use OneDrive, so maybe there's a way to link to that. It will require more research. Okay, so I'm finished my presentation. I'm going to post the link in the chat because I don't think it will work on this slide. And we have about 5 to 7 minutes to do this. Here's the resources I used for the presentation. And here are the references that I used. Okay, enjoy. If you have any questions, please ask, and don't forget to fill out the feedback form. Thanks very much.